if President Putin and the Russian military take even more extreme measures, extreme steps, including the deployment of chemical, biological, or tactical nuclear weapons. God forbid any of that happens. We're watching it all unfold.
I'm John Berman on the ground in Lviv in western Ukraine, where this war is now entering its second month. We do have new video this morning from the Russian-occupied port of Berdyansk, where Ukrainian forces say they destroyed a large Russian ship. Several videos captured an explosion and flames. You can see it right there. We're also getting new video this morning from Chernihiv showing destroyed buildings and debris-filled streets. That area has seen some of the most intense shelling since the invasion began.
And I'm Poppy Harlow, joining you live this morning as well. Just before the president arrived for these summits, a formal declaration from the Biden administration that Russian forces have committed war crimes. The attacks have triggered a huge flow of refugees, more than 3.6 million Ukrainians leaving the country to date. And stunningly, news from UNICEF this morning that 1 in every 2 Ukrainian children has been displaced since the Russian invasion began 1 month ago today. And now, news that the Biden administration plans to accept up to 100,000 refugees fleeing the war in Ukraine.
CNN has a team of correspondents around the globe. We're tracking all these major developments right now. Let's begin our coverage this hour here in Brussels. CNN's Chief White House correspondent Caitlin Collins is with us. Natasha Bertrand is also here at NATO headquarters following all these major developments. Caitlin, let's talk about the news that's unfolding right now. 30 NATO leaders meeting right now. We're expecting some major announcements.
Absolutely. And right now, this is just such an extraordinary moment where all of these leaders are in one room in a summit that was put together in days, not months like typically you see this, Wolf. And so it is extraordinary. Of course, one leader who is not here but did address the other leaders in the room this morning was Ukrainian President Zelensky, who made this appeal for more assistance to the leaders in the room, who, of course, have their own plans to unveil assistance, to talk about what they've done so far, and also talk about other measures to punish Putin. And that is something that President Biden is going to announce later on today, including what we told you about yesterday, those sanctions on hundreds of Russian lawmakers, something that President Zelensky has called for, but also the measures that they're taking when it comes to helping Europe not depend completely on Russian energy. That has been a real struggle for them, but it has given Russia a point of leverage in this entire invasion. And now the invasion is stretching into past 1 month now since Russia has started this invasion. But you're continuing to see President Zelensky call for more help. And so one big part of this is also the humanitarian aspect and the refugee crisis that this is called, and this has caused. And we are hearing that they do plan for the United States to announce that they are accepting up to 100,000 Ukrainian refugees into the United States. That number is so significant because last year alone, the United States did not come close to taking in 100,000 refugees. So saying they will take in up to 100,000 Ukrainian refugees is a really big step that we do expect President Biden to announce later on today.
U.S. didn't take in 100,000 refugees from around the whole world, let alone from one country, which the president is about to announce. Up to 100,000 Ukrainian refugees will be admitted into the United States, a very significant development. You're also getting some new reporting on what if the Russian military under Putin were to use chemical, biological, or tactical nuclear weapons.
This is a major concern. Obviously, President Biden and his aides have said that they are concerned Putin is preparing to conduct a chemical weapons attack in Ukraine. We've seen him conduct similar attacks like that before. And so that is a main concern for them. And it is something that we are told they are discussing in the room behind the scenes. But it's also something that President Biden has had his top aides discussing for several weeks now. 4 days after the invasion, the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, authorized a team of National Security Council officials to study and basically map out contingency plans if you do see Putin take that extreme step of conducting a chemical weapons attack, maybe deploying nuclear weapons, but chemical weapons seems to be their primary focus right now. And so that's a big question still. How would the United States respond? Because the president has ruled out U.S. military action in Ukraine, and that's a big question of whether or not that changes that calculus. And so we do know that in the room today, President Zelensky made appeals for more fighter jets to these leaders who are in the room. That is something that he has said repeatedly he needs. But we know the Pentagon has ruled that out as well, Wolf. One thing I should note, a senior U.S. official said that President Zelensky in that meeting today did not talk about joining NATO membership. And of course, that isn't something that Ukraine has put at their priority list. It is something that has angered Russia. And it really does loom over this NATO summit that is happening now.
Natasha Bertrand is also here in Brussels at the NATO headquarters. She's inside. You've been here for a few weeks already, Natasha. Update our viewers on what else you're learning about President Zelensky's message to these 30 NATO leaders.
Well, Wolf, President Zelensky essentially said today, look, the Ukrainian army has proven its worth here, has proven that it is capable of protecting Europe from a Russian onslaught, because, of course, Zelensky has been saying over the last several weeks that he believes that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is only a potential precursor to a larger operation by the Russians to take even more territory, and that he believes that Ukraine is basically serving as a buffer now. And he says, we have proven ourselves. Now it's time for NATO to prove itself. We have been saving lives. We have been conducting this operation that no one believed that we would be able to do. Now it's time for NATO to prove that it can also come to our aid and that it's able to save lives here. Take a listen to what he had to say this morning in a closed-door meeting with NATO leaders.
After this 1 month of war in a war with Russia, please do not tell us that our army is not up to NATO standards. We have shown what our standards are worth, how much we can give to the overall security of Europe and the world, how much we can do to protect ourselves protect everyone from aggression, to protect our shared values. But NATO is yet to show what NATO can do to save people's lives and to show that they are indeed the most powerful defensive alliance in the world.
So obviously Zelensky stopping just short there of calling yet again for Ukraine to become a member of NATO, but reiterating that he believes, of course, that Ukraine's military is up to NATO standards. And I should note here, Wolf, that it's very significant just how long Ukraine's military has been able to last in this fight. It is not something that the West had anticipated. In fact, defense officials were telling us before the war began that they expected Kyiv to last a matter of days before the Russians were able to run it over. Of course, they have lasted a month now. They have actually put the Russians back on their heels. The Russians are not gaining the kind of ground that they had wanted to because of that fierce Ukrainian resistance. And what we're seeing now is the Ukrainians telling the Western leaders, please keep it up. Please keep your support up to us so that we can continue to maintain this momentum against the Russians, because right now it's becoming increasingly difficult for them to get the kind of ammunition, anti-tank missiles, air defense systems that they need in order to successfully push the Russians back, Wolf.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Natasha. U.S. intelligence, military, political, they've all been so impressed with the Ukrainian military being able to deal with the Russian invading forces. You got to give the Ukrainian military, the Ukrainian people, and the President Zelensky a lot of credit for that. Natasha Bertrand, thank you very much. Caitlin, thanks to you as well. We're going to continue to stay on top of all the breaking news out of this NATO summit. In the meantime, let's go back to John Berman. He's in Ukraine for us, and as I always say, John, be careful over there.
Yeah, thanks so much, Wolf. You were just talking about the Ukrainian forces not just lasting, but succeeding in many cases. New this morning, Ukrainian officials claim success in the Russian-occupied port city of Berdyansk. Videos show fires at the port along with a series of explosions. Ukrainian armed forces say a large Russian warship was destroyed while 2 other ships were damaged. In this new video, you can see a couple of landing ships forced out of the port by the strike. CNN's Frederick Pleiken joins us now live from the capital in Kyiv. And Fred, I know you've been to Berdyansk. You've seen this port. Talk to us about the significance of this operation from the Ukrainian side.
Hi there, John. Well, it certainly seems like a significant operation. You're absolutely right. I was actually in the port of Berdyansk just in November, in late November of this year. It is obviously a strategic port for the Ukrainians, but very much also for the Russians as they try to resupply some of the fighting that they're doing down, especially when it comes to trying to continue that invasion of Mariupol, where, of course, that city has been under siege. But in general, to resupply the troops that they have there. And I think one of the interesting things that you see there is that large plume of smoke and what seems to be a big fire as well. That's certainly certainly seems to indicate that that ship might have had some form of munitions or also vehicles on it as well. If we talk about those landing ships, I've actually seen those in action by the Russian military, some of the maneuvers that they've had. They're essentially military cargo ships that can also land on beaches. They don't have very much in the way of cannons, but they can transport a lot of things, especially tanks and armored vehicles. So potentially the Russians might have lost a lot of those in this strike that took place by the Ukrainians. But another thing I think is interesting to point out, John, is that port in Berdyansk. The Ukrainians had been looking to upgrade the military part of that. There's a military and a civilian port in there. It's not a very big port. So if there's a big, massive ship burning in that port that the Russians aren't able to move, that could seriously make it difficult for them to continue to resupply their ships via that port. So certainly it seems like a big victory there by the Ukrainian forces.
And Fred, you mentioned Mariupol, not far from there. I do understand we have new video from that city, which has just been devastated over the last few weeks. Talk to us about what we're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's definitely a devastating scene there in Mariupol. That city is under siege. It's almost impossible for people to get in and out. There have been some humanitarian corridors that have worked to a certain degree, but I mean, some of the video that's coming out just shows the utter destruction in there. And if we just take a look at it for a second, I just want to just have our viewers see it, and I'll be silent for a few moments just when you watch that drive through Mariupol with just the utter destruction there. So you see that there are dead bodies laying there, destroyed cars, not a single building that seems to be untouched. I haven't seen anything like that since the worst days of the Syrian war that I obviously covered extensively as well. Mariupol certainly in a dire situation, and the people still trapped inside there, of course, very much in peril as those Russian forces continue to shoot in there, John.
I spoke to a woman who got out of Mariupol just a few days ago, and she was telling me about the bodies piling up on the streets because people were not safe enough to go outside and bury them. What a situation there, Fred. Frederick Bleiken for us in Kyiv this morning. Fred, thanks so much. Poppy, let's go back to you.
It's just remarkable to see that and hear the silence and then see that body there. Up next, how Russia is responding to the U.S. declaration, the formal declaration that Vladimir Putin is committing war crimes, and what will it actually mean? Plus, CNN speaks to 2 Ukrainian fighter pilots who were trained by Americans, how they're having success against a much larger Russian Air Force. And new this morning, as the world watches, Russia, North Korea appears to have launched a new type of intercontinental ballistic missile that landed just 100 miles from Japan's coast. What we know about that test later this hour.
is the work that continues, who we are today, and what we can become.
This is journalism that reflects the world we live in.
Christiana Wanpour in Amsterdam, Sarajevo, Afghanistan, with elements of the Galilee Division in Israel. Here we are in Habila, a village that has not had any food distribution since June. When the families have finished looking at the names, they come here. This is now a memorial to the victims of the Srebrenica massacre. We're very interested to see what's going on here. Mr. President, do you not think that the constant flip-flop on the issue of Bosnia sets a very dangerous precedent? This is a pretty shocking picture. Would you condemn President Assad for 100,000 plus deaths? You still have huge dreams. They didn't take that away from you. I saw you listening to that testimony. You look pretty broken up yourself. I wonder whether you ever think that other countries can learn from what you did.
I'm Becky Anderson, 200 meters above the city of Dubai. This is CNN.
Coronavirus. To get daily news updates in your inbox, sign up for the CNN newsletter. Coronavirus. Fact versus fiction.
Acai bowls. They're a popular breakfast and also Instagrammable. But big question, are they healthy? Well, acai bowls are made from puree.
This is CNN Breaking News.
Hi, I'm Eleni Jarkas, and we have breaking news to bring you. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg is speaking live. Let's listen in.
Security in a generation. President Putin's war against Ukraine. The people of Ukraine are resisting with courage and determination, fighting for their freedom and for their future. We stand with them. President Zelensky addressed us with an impassioned message, thanking NATO allies for the significant support we are providing and stressing the vital importance of even more military assistance. Today, NATO leaders agreed that we must and will provide further support to Ukraine. We will continue to impose unprecedented costs on Russia, and we will reinforce allied deterrence and defense. Leaders approved our 4 new battle groups in Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia. These are in addition to the 4 already in the Baltic countries and Poland. So we have 8 multinational NATO battle groups now, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Across Europe, there are 100,000 US troops supporting NATO efforts, and European allies and Canada have also stepped up. We have 40,000 forces under direct NATO command, mostly in the eastern part of the alliance, backed by major air and naval power, including an unprecedented 5 carrier strike groups from the high north to the Mediterranean. Today, NATO leaders agreed to reset our deterrence and defense for the longer term, to face a new security reality. On land, we will have substantially more forces in the eastern part of the alliance at higher readiness, with more pre-positioned equipment and supplies. In the air, we will deploy more jets and strengthen our integrated air and missile defense. At sea, we will have carrier strike groups, submarines, and significant numbers of combat ships on a persistent basis. We will also strengthen our cyber defenses and enhance our exercises focusing on collective defense and interoperability. I expect we will decide on the details at our next summit in Madrid in June. Today, Allied leaders also agreed to provide further support to Ukraine, helping to uphold their fundamental right to self-defense. Allies are also equipping Ukraine with significant military supplies, including anti-tank and air defense systems and drones, which are proving highly effective, as well as substantial financial and humanitarian aid. Today, we agreed to do more, including cyber security assistance and equipment to help Ukraine protect against biological, chemical, radiological, and nuclear threats. This could include detection, protection, and medical supplies, as well as training for decontamination and crisis management. We are determined to do all we can to support Ukraine, and I welcome the concrete offers of assistance made by allies today. At the same time, we have a responsibility to ensure the conflict does not escalate further, because this would be even more dangerous and more devastating. Allies agreed that we must also increase our support for other partners at risk from Russia at risk from Russian threats and interference, including Georgia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Working together and with the European Union, we must help them uphold their sovereignty and strengthen their resilience. We also addressed Beijing's role in the crisis. Today, Allied leaders called on China to refrain from supporting Russia's war effort. China must not provide economic or military support for the Russian invasion. Instead, Beijing should use its significant influence on Russia and promote an immediate peaceful resolution. Allies also agree that Belarus must stop acting as an accomplice to Putin's invasion. At today's meeting, leaders reaffirmed our strong commitment to NATO's open door policy under Article 10 of the Washington Treaty. NATO enlargement has been an historic success, spreading democracy, freedom and prosperity across Europe. 1 month since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, NATO's security environment has fundamentally changed for the long haul, and we are responding. But security does not come for free, and doing more will cost more. So NATO leaders agreed to redouble efforts to meet the defense investment pledge we made in 2014. Allies will submit additional plans on how to meet the pledge in time for the Madrid summit in June. And I welcome that a number of allies today announced plans for significant increases in defense spending. At this dangerous time, transatlantic unity and solidarity are vital. Europe and North America are standing and will continue to stand strong together in NATO. And with that, I'm ready to take your questions.
Okay, CNN.
Hi, Mr. Secretary General. Thank you. President Zelensky, in his address to NATO, accused Russia of deploying phosphorus munitions. I'm wondering whether NATO has seen evidence of that and what your response is or would be. And then I'm wondering, did you discuss during this meeting a permanent basing of forces in any of these countries, such as the Baltics, and abandoning the NATO-Russia Founding Act?
So we are resetting NATO's deterrence and defense for the long term, with more troops, with more air assets and more maritime capabilities. We have already increased our presence in the East, and today we decided on 4 new battle groups, and the leaders agreed to task our military commanders to provide options for a long-term reset of our presence, our military posture in the eastern part of the alliance and across the whole alliance. Details will be then decided at our summit in June. But that comes on top of what we have already done. So this is long term. We are prepared for long haul because we can already today say that the Russian invasion, President Putin's invasion of Ukraine, has changed our security environment for the long term. It's a new reality. It's a new normal, and NATO is responding for the long term. We have seen very credible reports about the use of military force against civilians, and of course this is of great concern for all NATO allies.
NBC. Secretary General, thank you for taking my question. How do you believe NATO will respond if China begins to support Russia economically and perhaps with military supplies? And also, do you believe that there's a role to play for NATO when it comes to alleviating energy costs? And I'm talking about speaking directly to Saudi Arabia and other OPEC producers. Thank you.
So NATO allies are coordinating their efforts when it comes to also energy security, and it was also addressed in the meeting today to step up supplies, to diversify sources of supply, and also to reduce dependence on supplies from Russia. And later on today, I also participate in the G7 meeting, and of course, in different frameworks, G7 working with the EU, there are different formats where NATO allies address the need to strengthen energy security and reduce dependence on Russian oil and gas. Our message to China is that they should join the rest of the world and clearly condemn the brutal war against Ukraine and not support Russia, neither with economic support or, of course, not with military support.
Okay, we'll go to Interfax Ukraine, late in the second row. Yeah.
General News Agency Interfax Ukraine. I would like to ask you if Polish leadership put at the table today for discussion the proposal to send peacekeeping mission to Ukraine, and if yes, what kind of discussion it was, and is there some conclusion? Thank you.
As we discussed a wide range of issues, and the message is that we have to stand united. And also that we need to provide support to Ukraine, but at the same time we have a responsibility to ensure that this conflict do not become a full-fledged war between NATO and Russia. And that's also the reason why allies have made it clear that we will not deploy troops on the ground in Ukraine, because the only way to do that is to be prepared to engage in full conflict with Russian troops.
Okay, Financial Times.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. Congratulations on your annual extension. You said in the statement that allies agreed to enhance preparedness and readiness for chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats. Is that based on credible intelligence that those threats could be imminent? And how does the alliance strengthen its protection against those threats? Thank you.
So we are concerned, partly because we see the rhetoric and we see that Russia is trying to create some kind of pretext accusing Ukraine, United States, NATO allies for preparing to use chemical and biological weapons. And we have seen before that this way of accusing others is actually a way to create a pretext for do the same themselves. And of course, the accusations against Ukraine and NATO allies are absolutely false. Any use of chemical weapons will totally change the nature of the conflict. It will be a blatant violation of international law, and it will have widespread consequences and, of course, be extremely dangerous. It will affect the people in Ukraine, but there's also a risk that will have a direct effect on people living in NATO countries, because we can see contamination, we can see the spread of chemical agents or biological weapons into our countries. We also know that Russia has used chemical agents against its own opposition, and they have used it on NATO territory in Salisbury before. And we also know that Russia has facilitated, supported the Assad regime in Syria when they used chemical weapons against their own population. So this just highlights the importance of ending this war immediately, because this is a dangerous situation. And therefore we impose the sanctions, therefore we support Ukraine. Allies agreed to supply equipment to help Ukraine protect against chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear threats. This could include detection equipment, protection and medical support, as well as training for decontamination and crisis management. We are also enhancing allies' preparedness and readiness for chemical and biological and nuclear threats. Our top military commander, General Walters, has activated NATO's chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear defense elements, and allies are deploying additional chemical and biological and nuclear defenses to reinforce our existing and new battle groups. So we are taking measures both to support Ukraine and also to defend ourselves.
Okay, we'll go to Al Jazeera.
Secretary General James Bays from Al Jazeera. President Zelensky, when he addressed you, recalled the fact he first spoke to you a month ago, and he says he didn't get clear answers. So this time he asked you specifically for 1% of all your tanks, for 1% of all your aircraft, for multi-launch rocket systems, anti-ship weapons and means of air defence. A very specific list. What is your clear answer?
We all listened very carefully to President Zelensky, and many of the leaders in the room have had contacts with him over these weeks. I also spoke with him, and the Ukrainian defense minister participated in our defense ministerial meeting last week. We listened carefully, and of course we took note of his very compassionate message to all NATO allies. NATO allies provide significant support to Ukraine. And we provide also lethal weapons, advanced systems, and also systems that help them to shoot down planes and attack battle tanks with anti-tank weapons and many other types of systems, including drones. I will not go into the details of the exact type of systems we are deploying. There is close contact between NATO allies and Ukraine. But what I can say is that allies do what they can to support Ukraine with weapons so Ukraine can defend themselves. Self-defense is a right enshrined in the UN Charter. At the same time, we have a responsibility to prevent this conflict from becoming a full-fledged war in Europe involving not only Ukraine and Russia, but NATO allies and Russia. That will be more dangerous and more devastating. And I think we have to be honest about that, and that's exactly what we have been in our meeting today, and also what I say to you in the press conference now. So again, no clear answer. Well, what we do is that we are delivering a lot of equipment, and that is an answer, but I will not go into the details. I don't think that's wise for operational reasons if I listed exactly what and when and how. We are delivering essential equipment to Ukraine. NATO allies have stepped up, and it's essential for the progress they have been able to make in the fight against the invading Russian forces.
Thank you very much, colleagues. I know there are many questions. I'm afraid the Secretary General needs to go to the G7 meeting, but there will be other briefings throughout the day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Right, that was NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg giving an update after the NATO extraordinary meeting between 30 leaders. And this was really significant because US President Joe Biden was there as well. He basically told us yesterday that there's going to be a reset on deterrence and defense and shoring up the eastern flank, which he went through in terms of land, sea, as well as air, and really reiterating NATO's stance in terms of supporting Ukraine with anything that they need. They said they're upping the ante on that in terms of anything to do with biochemical weapons, radiological threats as well, to ensure that they are prepared for that, but then reiterating, importantly, that they do not want to see an escalation. All right, so we will stay across this breaking story throughout the day. For now, it's back to New Day.
Chief White House correspondent Caitlin Collins is reporting right now, and I think this is also pretty significant if you see what's going on. That there's at least some discussion at a very, very serious level. What does the U.S. military, what did the Biden administration do if the Russians were, God forbid, to use chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons? There's a whole group out there that discusses this all the time, right?
Well, I think, look, you know, you covered the Pentagon. We're a planning organization. Our job is to think about contingencies, to think about the hypotheticals. And it wouldn't be very smart for me to get into speculating right now. We haven't seen any indications that the Russians are preparing to use weapons of mass destruction inside Ukraine. But you've heard President Biden talk about this, Wolf. If that were to happen, there would be a significant response, not just from the United States, but from the international community. And I think it's better if we don't speculate about what that response would be. We haven't seen the indications now. And again, we continue to call on Mr. Putin to do the right thing right now, which is end the war. He can end it right now.
Yeah, you're not going to explain what the response would be because it follows this concept of deliberate ambiguity. Let the Russians worry about what that response would be.
We'll just stay away from speculating.
Without any speculating at this point. Admiral Kirby, thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be with you.
The Pentagon Press Secretary, John Kirby. Appreciate it very much. Poppy, back to you.
Yeah, what a critical interview in this moment. Wolf, thank you very much for that. Still ahead, CNN speaks to 2 Ukrainian fighter pilots who were trained by Americans, how they're preventing Russia from taking control of the skies over their country. That's next.
この美しい場所をシリコンバレーのような地域にできないかと考えて町のデジタル化に取り組みました。全国屈指の光ブロードバンド環境を整えたことで今や20社ほどの最先端企業のサテライトオフィスが集まる一大 IT 都市になりつつあります。で、起業を目指す若者たちが海外からも集まってきています。
モバイルクリニックに乗車する看護師が患者と直接コミュニケーションをとってサポートすることで医師は病院にいながら患者も遠出することなくオンラインで診療が行われています。
データの力が日本の地方を元気にして日本全体の新たな成長を切り開いていきます。
One of the things that we came to realize during this pandemic is how unprepared we are to be able to address a crisis like this. We see that the world is very fragile. Supply chains are very fragile. So I think one of the positives that might come from this is that after the pandemic is over and we reflect upon what we've learned, we can perhaps put systems and procedures in place to ensure that the workers around the world are protected and to have the private sector be an active part of that process. We had 0.5% of the victims in the world being helped. That means with all of the government, United Nations, and private sector organizations combined, we're not even hitting 1%. In order for us to change that, we need to get the private sector, civil society, governments all working together in a positive, supportive way to address this issue. We have to be united because what we're dealing with here is one of the most horrific crimes you can possibly imagine. So the Mekong Club is working with civil society, the private sector, and other organizations to bring about this outcome. And perhaps as a result of this, we can go from 0.5% to 5% or 50% someday as we continue to move forward to address modern slavery.
It really only takes a few moments to gain an appreciation of just how tough it is out here. They've been coming across sniper fire, gunfire, mortar rounds. You can see really just how intense it is here.
I have to wrap it up right now. Quite anxious about spending too much time on scene.
Those are the kids really struggling to get away.
They feel like they won't be able to outrun the war.
They thought the whole border was open. People are just trying to bust through towards what they think is going to be a better life. These nurses, these doctors really have nerves of steel.
You can't help but be struck by how interconnected our world is.
Arwa Damon, CNN.
All right, you are looking at live pictures there. President Biden at NATO headquarters in Brussels. According to the planned schedule for him, he is on his way to what is known as the class photo for the G7, where they all gather, show the world that they are united. Taking some comments here, having a discussion on his way. We'll keep a very close eye on this. And of course, we'll bring you that class photo with G7 leaders as soon as it comes on the screen. Let's keep monitoring this, and let's also bring in retired General Wesley Clark. He is former NATO Supreme Allied Commander. General Clark, thank you very much, and forgive me in advance if I need to interrupt our conversation for the president here. But I do want to ask you if we could begin with this reporting about what our Caitlin Collins confirmed, which is that there is now within the administration a Tiger team. And the so-called Tiger team, that's what they're calling it internally, has been focused for weeks now on creating contingency plans for several possible scenarios, including, God forbid, Russia using chemical weapons, for example, or biological weapons. Can you explain what discussions are like within a unit like that, having to really prepare for the worst?
Certainly. Well, these are discussions that examine action, reaction, counteraction. So they start with some postulates about what might be reasonable Russian uses. In other words, what could we imagine the Russians might do, when and where, and what circumstances. Then they lay out what we would do or could do in response, and then they try to think through the consequences for both sides of what would happen. So, and it's bounced back and forth and debated a lot. And it is an amazing thing when you put a group of very well-informed people together, how a consensus can emerge, how the issues are shaped, and so forth. So, I think this is a very, very smart way to move forward for the administration.
Let's take General Clark, stand by, please. Let's take a quick listen here. Okay, General Clark, you said recently that the world should be, in your words, expecting a frustrated Putin to do something. Can you elaborate on what you mean? And also, how would you, if you were in your prior post as NATO Supreme Allied Commander, how would you be preparing for that?
Well, I think, first of all, you have to anticipate what he might do. So the use of chemical weapons seems to me a little bit premature, except perhaps in going after Mariupol, but it's not that significant. So I think the chemical weapons threat is a more far-fetched threat. If he really wants to deter NATO involvement and he believes that he can shatter NATO, then he would perhaps use a low-yield nuclear weapon. And where would he use it? Probably not in Ukraine, but perhaps on the staging areas or some populated area in Poland. This is what's usually done in the Russian exercises. So the way they postulate in their exercises is that if Russia starts to lose because of NATO support for the opposition, then pow, they send a nuclear weapon in. NATO says, oh my goodness, we don't want a nuclear war. That would be the Third World War. Okay, since you're that serious about it, we'll back off. So this is the way the Russians have educated themselves to think about what they would do in a circumstance like this. And this is why there's so much concern on the part of the administration and other NATO leaders, because we all know this.
As we look at these world leaders, the G7 coming together for these photos, we also see right there as they get ready to take this photograph together, Jens Stoltenberg. Wolf, let me bring you in here just to explain to our viewers, and General Clark, stay with us. The significance of this moment, obviously, they've been meeting behind closed doors, but this is really for the world to see, Wolf, and to send a very clear signal of unity.
And General Clark will really appreciate this. This is a meeting that the G7 leaders are having here at NATO headquarters in Brussels. It's pretty unusual, and General Clark would know for sure. It's pretty extraordinary for the G7 leaders to actually meet here. And I want our viewers to know the G7 countries, United States, Germany, Japan, the UK, France, Italy, and Canada, along with the European Union as a group. They are meeting right now following this NATO summit of 30 NATO allies. They're meeting, and then later in the day, President Biden will attend a third round of talks with the European Union leadership, all the members of the European Union. And General Clark, let me just ask you, how extraordinary is it in one day, hastily organized meetings by the President of the United States with the NATO alliance, with the EU, and the G7?
That's right. And nothing is more important, really, Wolf, than the unity among these leaders. And you see the handshakes and you see the smiles. They're all under enormous pressure. And they're leaning on each other, really, for support, for leadership, for ideas. It's a remarkable moment.
It certainly is, and we're watching it, Poppy, as we see what's going on. We see these leaders. They're all. This is a photo opportunity. They're all very serious right now. There's a war going on, and a lot of Ukrainians, sadly, are being killed by the Russians.
Yeah, and General Clark, to you, as I mentioned, joining the G7 leaders, you do have NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg just off of that announcement yesterday that NATO is doubling its battle groups along the eastern flank, talking particularly about 4 of those battle groups in Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Slovakia. Wolf made the great point to John Kirby just a few moments ago that that forces have essentially doubled from 20,000 to 40,000 in critical areas. I mean, how significant is that posture change?
Well, I think it's an important signal for NATO agreement and resolve, because these posture changes have to be unanimous. And so NATO is agreeing that it will defend itself. But you know, Poppy, in 1993, NATO had this debate also about whether it could go beyond its defensive areas. And in 1993, the NATO Secretary General Manfred Werner put out this idea. He said NATO either has to go out of area or go out of business. And so in the 1990s, NATO did take action in the Balkans, in Bosnia, later in Kosovo, later went to Afghanistan. So NATO has been out of area. It's not simply going to hide behind its red lines. That's what NATO's saying right now. So NATO has to decide how it will be useful in preserving European security. That's its real mission. It's not just defense. What NATO recognized 25 years ago is it had 30 years ago, is it has to provide European defense, you have to have European security, and that means stabilization. So you have to deal with this issue in Ukraine. You can't just ignore it.
General Wesley Clark, thank you so much, especially on a day like today and a moment like this. We really appreciate it. We do have more from Brussels ahead as we cover President Biden's emergency summit with those G7 leaders. Our coverage continues right after this.
Apple cider vinegar is one of the most popular natural health products out there, but don't believe everything you read. Never use it, for instance, to whiten your teeth. It's too acidic and will just ruin your enamel. It also doesn't work well for acne, lice, or warts. But now for the good news. Apple cider vinegar may help lessen the itch of mosquito bites. Who knew? And it might help you lose a little weight as part of a healthy diet plan. Try it drizzled on salads and fish and poultry, and studies show apple cider vinegar can help lower blood sugar levels. A randomized clinical trial found 2 spoonfuls of apple cider vinegar in a glass of water twice a day with a lunch and dinner can lower fasting blood glucose levels by 10 points. If you decide to add apple cider vinegar to your diet, check with your doctor. It can interfere with some medications, especially drugs for diabetes and some diuretics.
in Sana'a, Yemen, and this is CNN.
Ukraine has so far been able to prevent the Russian Air Force from taking full control of Ukraine's airspace, thanks in part to the expertise of pilots trained in the United States. CNN spoke with 2 Ukrainian fighter pilots this morning. They go by their call signs Moonfish and Juice. John Berman is back with us live from Lviv, Ukraine with more. I mean, it's pretty extraordinary just what they've been able to accomplish and now learning more about how they've been trained.
Yeah, it really is remarkable. And by the way, they go by their call signs with us because we want to protect their identities. And you'll also notice they're wearing their full gear because we didn't want people to see their faces. These are pilots. They speak great English. Why? Because they trained in the United States right alongside American pilots. And in some cases, they have more combat experience than most U.S. pilots. Why? Because they've been fighting the Russians in the air in the East since 2014. And I wanted to know, Poppy, what's worked for them? How have they been able to keep it so the Russians don't have complete air superiority? Listen.
What I would say that combining